Hi and welcome back to the channel. Last week I shared with you a few essential steps you can take in the field to ensure that you get the best possible autofocusing performance. And today I'm going to share with you a few essential settings that you should be tweaking within your camera to ensure that you get beautiful and razor sharp in-focus images every time you go out. And make sure to watch the whole video to hear about my latest discovery, a tweak that shouldn't really work but has improved my results dramatically. And on top of that, I'm also going to share some specific new tweaks I found for the autofocus when it comes to the R5 Mark II and the R7. I'm Wegener, and for over 20 years I've dedicated myself to capturing unique bird photos and videos and helping others just like you to create your own masterpieces. Each week I bring you in-depth camera gear reviews, essential field techniques, the latest camera news and powerful editing tips, all to help you to elevate your own photography game. Today we're going to talk about the Canon autofocus system, but if you want me to make similar videos for Sony and Nikon, make sure to let me know in the comments. When we look at Canon's autofocusing system and the menu structure, we have to distinguish between the older style menu in cameras like the R5, the R3, R6, R6 Mark II and also the DSLR cameras, and the newer style menu we can now find in the R5 Mark II, the R1, and I assume also in all new Canon cameras going forward. The good thing for us is that it's actually now easier in the newer style menu to set up the autofocus. With that in mind, let's jump in and supercharge your autofocus. In all Canon cameras, the autofocusing menu is always the pink one, matching the nice pink robin there behind me as well, and this is where we're going to make all our changes. And the first thing we want to change here is to set the autofocus operation to servo. That means whenever we hold down whichever button we've assigned for focusing, the camera will track our subject continuously. Now you might say, but Jan, on my camera I can't find the servo option, and that is because you don't have a lens attached to your camera. You can only set the camera into servo mode if you have a lens attached to it. Otherwise it will usually just say manual focus. The AI servo is not to be confused with the continuous autofocus that is available in the older style menu cameras. If you set your camera to continuous autofocus, it will actually continuously autofocus even without you pressing any buttons. Now this is good for video mode, but this is definitely not what you want to activate in photo mode. Next, I would go ahead and make a few tweaks that will allow me to have two different autofocusing modes available on two different buttons on the camera. In particular, I want to have my base autofocusing mode as spot autofocus, where I can move the focus point all over the image and focus on whatever I want. And then on another button, I want to have the eye tracking autofocus, where the camera finds a subject for me and tracks it all over the viewfinder. And having those two modes assigned to two different buttons will give me the best of both worlds. However, today I don't want to go into great detail how to set that up because I've already done a few setup videos where I show that in great detail, so you can check those out, or you can also check out my PDF setup guides that are also linked down there in the description. What I want to focus on today is crucial tweaks that will directly impact your autofocusing performance. And in Canon's case, what impacts the autofocusing performance the most is the autofocus cases. In the older style menu, we have various different cases available that offer us preset settings for certain situations, and we can also tweak the settings within these cases. And in the newer style menu, we're only left with two cases now, the automatic case or the manual case, which has actually made it much easier to set it up. What each of these cases and settings does is to adjust the camera's autofocusing system's response to certain situations that are happening when you're tracking a subject. For instance, what do you want the camera to do if there's another subject entering your frame? Or how do you want the camera to respond if there's suddenly an obstacle obstructing the view of your subject for a brief moment? For most Canon cameras that I've used, and that's a lot of them, setting up the autofocus has actually been fairly straightforward. However, there's two cameras that I found a little bit more tricky to set up, and I had to tweak the cases a lot more to get satisfying results. So for those two cameras, I will share a few more specific tips that should help you to get the best autofocusing performance. For cameras that have the older style menu like an R5, an R3, an R6 Mark II, an R7, an R8, the 5D series, the 7D series, setting up the autofocus has actually been pretty straightforward. And my go-to has always been case 1. And then I set the two parameters to -1. And over the years, that has given me some fantastic autofocusing performance on all these cameras, where the autofocus is reasonably aggressive, but also sticks nicely to your subject. In the newer style menu cameras like the R5 Mark II and the R1, my go-to setting that I would always try first would be the auto case smack bang in the middle. And on a camera like the R1, that works fantastically well and has given me great results in the field, and I never really felt like I actually need to make any tweaks on that R1 camera. So for all cameras going forward that have the new menu, I would always try the stock standard auto setting first, and only if that fails me or I feel like the camera is doing something that I don't want it to do, I would start messing around with the cases by adjusting either the parameters or go to the manual case and then manual set the parameters. And this is actually what I had to do with the R5 Mark II. Because on the standard auto setting, the camera has the tendency to eventually wander off your subject if you focus on the subject for too long. And the autofocus also felt a little bit hyperactive, like it was still searching for your target, even though it was already on the target. And it just felt like I wanted to calm it down a little bit more and make it more sticky. For action photography, this wasn't as much of an issue, but it definitely showed up when I tried to photograph perch birds. And so I came up with one setting that worked very well for me for perch birds. So I go into the manual setting and set the parameters to -2 and -1. And that has definitely calmed down the autofocus, made it less hyperactive and a bit more sticky on my subject. So overall, the performance on that setting I found very satisfactory for perch birds. However, sometimes when I was photographing a bird taking off from a perch, for instance, the autofocus would now be almost too sticky and stick to the perch rather than the bird taking off. Or I had situations where I was photographing a bird in the grass, for instance, and the autofocus would still eventually wander off my subject onto the grass. So I tried the different cases first, the auto case, then the auto on -1, and then the manual case with the settings on -2 and -1, but all of these cases still had the autofocus wander off the bird onto the grass after focusing onto the bird for a few seconds. So I was getting a little bit frustrated and thought, why not try something crazy? So I went back to the autofocus cases, went to auto, and instead of trying to calm down the autofocus, make it more sticky, I just set it to +1 to being more responsive. And to my big surprise, this actually worked really well, and making the autofocus more aggressive and more responsive actually somehow helped the R5 Mark II to stick to my subject better, and it basically eliminated the wandering off onto the grass from the bird. I will have to do a few more tests in the field to confirm that this actually is maybe the best overall solution for the R5 Mark II, but at the moment I have both of my R5 Mark II camera bodies set to auto and +1, and the results so far have been surprisingly good. Now, it doesn't really make sense that a too hyperactive autofocus actually calms down if you make it more responsive, but for some reason it seems like if you allow the autofocus to be a bit more aggressive, it has an easier time to stick on our subject, and it also helps with birds taking off from a perch. The other camera that has given me a little bit of trouble when it comes to the autofocus is the R7. And this camera has the tendency to slightly jump on and off your subject, and so in a burst of images you will usually have some photos that are in focus and some that are out of focus. And that is definitely annoying, and the standard setting that I like to use on all these cameras with the older style menu, case 1 set to -1 on both parameters, didn't really solve that issue for me. And the case that has seemed to work the best for me on the R7 is to use case 1 but set both parameters to -2. And using that in the field has definitely given me a better autofocusing performance and the best overall results I was able to get with that camera. And here's another important tip for all Canon R7 users, and this actually comes from Canon directly. If you want to get the best autofocusing performance with that camera, it makes sense to reduce the frame rate from 30 frames per second to 15 frames per second, because then the autofocusing will be more accurate. So basically the camera is too fast for its own good, and reducing the frames per second will help the autofocus to give you better and more sticky results on top of tweaking the cases. But even if we set up the camera in the best way possible and take all the right steps in the field, our job is not done yet, because we have to learn to transform our RAW files into fantastic looking final images. I think this is the one area where most photographers could improve the most. And to help you with that, I developed my Lightroom and next generation Photoshop Masterclasses. In my Masterclasses, I teach you step by step and in easy to follow chapters a fast and efficient workflow that will give you the knowledge necessary to transform any of your own RAW files into true standouts ready to be shared with the world. But you won't just be watching. I'm providing you with my own RAW file so you can edit right alongside me. And if you're not sure if my classes are worth it or the right fit for you, check out some of the amazing reviews that I receive daily from people who I've helped to transform their editing lives forever and who found my classes extremely helpful. So if you want to take the guesswork out of editing and turn it from a frustrating chore into a rewarding and fun process, make sure to check out my Lightroom and Next Generation Photoshop Masterclasses down there in the description. And now it's time to look at some of these menu items that have very strange names so no one ever knows what they are, but tweaking these can definitely have a big impact on your autofocusing performance. And the first one on the older style menu cameras is called switching tracked subjects, which basically determines how quickly your camera will jump onto a new subject entering the frame. On the newer style cameras, this is not available anymore, but on the older style camera, I usually have this setting set to 1, which is the standard setting. Another setting that I find quite important when I shoot a lot of action is the servo first image priority, and I always set that to release, which means that the camera will fire whenever I press the shutter button. If you set that to focus priority, it means that there could sometimes be a delay when you press the shutter button and the camera will only take a photo once you have acquired focus. But I don't like that for action because that little delay when pressing the shutter button could mean that I'm actually slipping off my subject. And the next setting is hidden behind a very strange name, and it's called retract lens on power off. And what that setting does is whenever you turn your camera off or it goes into sleep mode or standby mode, it will defocus, which is extremely annoying and makes it very difficult to do something that we talked about in my last video, the pre-focusing. And if you remember correctly, pre-focusing is essential in getting the best autofocusing results. So if your camera is actually sabotaging the pre-focusing, that's not a good thing. So I would always turn the retract lens on power off. The only reason this setting actually exists is that it can protect certain lenses like a 35mm 1.8 lens that protrude out when you're using it. If you turn this setting off, this lens will not protrude back when you're turning off the camera and you might damage the lens. So for certain lenses, leaving this setting on might make sense, but especially if you're using longer lenses and want to do nature photography and have to pre-focus, turning this setting off is very important and makes your experience in the field much better. Next, we have another setting where I didn't know for a long time what it actually meant. And Canon recommends turning this off when you're using long lenses, but I actually like to leave it on. I'm talking about lens drive when autofocus impossible. And this is an interesting setting because if you turn that off, it will basically not allow the camera to jump onto the background when it slips off your subject. In theory, that's fantastic, right? The only downside with this is that you then also can't focus into the distance anymore. Let's say you're focusing on a bird that's near you and suddenly a bird shows up 20 or 30 meters behind the bird that you're focusing on, or birds flying overhead that you quickly want to focus on. If you turn the lens drive when autofocus impossible off, your camera will now not be able to focus on that distant subject anymore unless you pre-focus enough that the camera can basically already see the subject and then it will jump onto it. So while it's great that the camera won't jump onto the background anymore, not being able to focus on whatever I want, whenever I want, I kind of find it a little bit annoying. So in most cases, I actually leave this on and run the risk that the camera will jump onto my background because I like the ability to quickly focus on the background or quickly focus on a bird overhead, for instance. But in certain situations where you notice a tendency in the camera of jumping onto the background, turning this off can make a big difference for you because whenever the camera will now slip off your subject, it will not start focus searching and stay in sort of the same focal plane, not letting it jump onto the background, which can definitely be helpful in certain scenarios. And there's two more for you. The first one is the orientation linked autofocusing points. So I like to set this setting to having different autofocusing points for horizontal and vertical shooting. So whichever point I select in horizontal shooting mode will stay there. And if I turn the camera to vertical mode, select a different point and then go back to horizontal, that vertical point will also remain the same. And if I go back to vertical shooting, I will still have that vertical point selected, which I find much better in the field. And the last one that I think is very important as well is to turn on the lens electronic manual focus. The standard setting is set up in a way that oftentimes when you're autofocusing or actively using the lens, you cannot manually interfere with the focusing, and I think that is terrible. Because a lot of times I like to fine-tune my autofocus with the manual focus ring. For instance, my camera jumps off my subject onto a branch or onto the background. The quickest way of bringing it back is often not even using the spot autofocus, but just ripping on that manual focus ring and bringing the focus back to me. So I like to go into the pink menu and make sure that manual autofocusing is available on all times, because it greatly helps me in the field to fine tune the autofocus and quickly bring it back onto target if it jumps off my target. And that brings me to the end of this video. I hope the in the field autofocusing tips last week and the tweaks you can make in the camera today will help you tremendously in only taking razor sharp and in focus images going forward. And now you know what to do. Comment, like, subscribe, and I will see you guys in another video very soon. Bye!